So just to give you a bit of background, one of the things that became clear to me as I really got into U.S. Mexico policy and understanding the nature of the Mexican state, especially after 2018, was that what previously had been a state with a crime problem became almost crime with the state problem, in a sense. And it's a little bit of a glib thing to say, but really what I believe we've seen evolve, and any of you panelists, feel free to challenge me on this, in the past decade has been something fundamentally qualitatively different from, I would say, quote-unquote, normal corruption, which existed in Mexico, it exists in the United States, it exists across a variety of governments around the world. But what we've seen in Mexico is really this phenomenon of a state that exists in synthesis with its own criminal networks. So not in opposition to it, but actually in active cooperation with it, and also requiring those criminal networks access to the goods that they provide, and vice versa, for the sustenance of its role. So that's what we're here to talk about today with the Estado de Narco panel. And so I'll start with you, Celina, then I want to go down and get kind of opening statements from all three of you. Do you concur with the definition? What do you see that's qualitatively different, and how do we handle the Estado de Narco? Small questions.
Sure. So let me take you back to September 2010. At the Council of Foreign Relations here in Washington, D.C., and I was actually present, then Secretary of State Hillary Clinton stated that drug-related violence in Mexico was beginning to resemble a narco state and a Colombian-style insurgency with traffickers controlling parts of the country. She said it's looking more and more like Colombia looked 20 years ago, and where the narco traffickers controlled certain parts of the country. She added, these drug cartels are showing more and more indices of insurgency. So that's when we started talking about this term, the narco state. So it's actually not a Republican or Democratic term. It's been with us for 15 years. So when we think about Mexico, the way I think of Mexico, I don't think we're at state capture yet. And actually, remember, Mexico is made of multiple states. So it's actually at the sub-state level as opposed to the national level. I think it's actually a criminalized state. I would not necessarily use narco state as well as state capture yet, but that's a subject of debate.
Dr. Wood, what are your thoughts?
Thank you. I mean, I'm going to be boring and agree with pretty much everything that Celina said. I think that precision is really, really important. We can toss around terms like narco state, but the truth is in Mexico, being a federal system, there's an enormous amount of diversity, and it's extremely fluid as well. You can visit one part of the country which is very, very safe, that there isn't a strong presence of organized crime, but 2 years later, you go there and things have changed entirely. And that's because of the dynamics, the very fluid dynamics between organized crime groups and between the state writ large and those organized crime groups. And I would include there the role of the United States as well. And I would say that Mexico should be understood as a country which has fragmented co-government in specific territories. It means that, in some parts of government, you will find that there is a very strong presence of organized crime in general and criminality. In other parts of government, much less so. But we also can't be blind to the fact that there have been senior government officials within successive Mexican governments that have been working with organized crime, and we have a lot of evidence to support that. Cartels organized crime groups increasingly seek to influence elections. They do penetrate local governments. They shape policing and judicial outcomes. And of course, that's very, very important in the context of the recent judicial reform in Mexico. They control territory and economic activity to a wide degree in specific locations. And I think we can say that we've seen the relationship between state actors and organized crime groups to be often transactional rather than ideological. And that goes back decades in Mexico. And I'll give you the classic example that everybody uses, the term of plata o plomo, silver or lead. Many, many years ago, we hosted a mayor from a small town in the state of Puebla, here in Washington. And we sat down with him and we talked about the infiltration of organized crime within his municipality. And I said, can you rely on your police force? Are they corrupt? And he said, they're good men, but there's 8 of them. I don't have a budget to really buy them gasoline for their cars. I don't have much of a budget to buy them bullets for their guns. And he says, and anyway, there's 8 of them. Even if I had them armed to the teeth, the local crime group can mobilize hundreds of heavily armed men, within minutes and get them to a location. So it's not that they are corrupt. They're good men who are trying to do a job. But are they going to lay down their lives for nothing? No, they're probably not. And, you know, all of us, I think, in this room have heard multiple stories that are similar to that. And, of course, it extends into the political realm as well, where politicians are offered a choice between accept the bribe or we're going to kill you or we're going to kill somebody in your family. And that's a really, really difficult situation to be in.
Thank you very much. Senor Clouthier, you have lived this in some dramatic ways. Would love your views.
The first idea I want to share is the Mexican state, the government, has the power and the means to defeat the mafia. They do have the power. The second one is the arrogance of the mafia in Mexico, or the cartels, or whatever you want to call them, is proportional to the absence or to the complicity of the state. And we have a very arrogant mafia in Mexico, especially in my state, in Sinaloa, where I come from. So we can conclude too that the main problem in Mexico is not the absence of the state, but the complicity. Because there is no mafia without institutional support. We cannot have a mafia or cartel, whatever you want to call them, I insist, without political corruption, without political complicity. So the presence, for example, of the cartels in Sinaloa, the state where I live, is an undeniable sign of political corruption. We have had for decades this problem in Sinaloa. I have denounced it publicly for decades too, more than 25 years, saying, hey, we have a problem here, hey. Nobody cares. Now we're paying the consequence. If you want to know who rules over a territory, ask the people. My hobby is hunting. And I can tell you that animals are territorial. So the most animalistic instinct of a human being must be territorial. Leaders of cartels are territorial. You want to take control, get control of the territory.
Thank you very much. You know, we might as well dive in on the most contentious illumination of the Estado de Narco, however defined today, which is obviously the indictment of the governor of Sinaloa, Realuyo Moyo, who, together with Senator Nzunza and 8 of their closest friends, is now wanted by the U.S. Department of Justice for a variety of crimes involving corruption, trafficking, and so on. Talk to us a little bit about your views on that case, because I know you have some, and how that relates to this synthesis of criminality and the state that we're talking about here.
We are sending the message that not even narcos nor narco politicians are unbeatable. They are humans, and they're going to pay and are going to be accountable. So what can I do with that message? I have to give an applause.
Listen, it's been coming for a long time. There's been a lot of discussion about the United States insisting that politicians who are involved with organized crime begin to pay the price. And so it's not a surprise that this has happened. You know, some people have said we've crossed the Rubicon, that we're in a new reality. And I think that the reaction from the Mexican government, I think it's very understandable. I think it's worth putting ourselves in the shoes of the Mexican government at this point in time to think, you know, what would it be like if a sitting American governor was indicted by a foreign government? What would the reaction be? And I think the smart thing is to say, let's begin a full investigation, you know, because if there's compelling evidence, then let's do it. And, you know, let's remember the sort of the foundations of any functioning justice system. There should be a proper investigation, the gathering of evidence, the forensic approach, essentially. And I think that set a confusing precedent, I think, for some people in Mexico. But, honestly, my reaction to it is that kind of saw it coming, but it does put the Mexican government now in a very difficult position, and I'm not surprised by the president's reaction.
So it's a sign of the judicial instrument of national power, and it's also quite reflective of the Trump administration's position on narco-terrorists. In the first Trump administration, the DEA actually arrested the sitting Minister of Defense at the time, Cienfuegos, then who was returned to Mexico, who then was found innocent of all charges, in spite of 7 years of DEA investigations. So it's kind of reminiscent of that. When I brought today the new counterterrorism strategy by the White House, only 16 pages, where it's a full frontal assault on narco-terrorist groups. And it's an area where we're going to see a lot more of the different instruments of national power that are being used. You see it now through what we're doing in the Caribbean with the drug boats. So that's the military instrument of national power. Then you've seen sanctions, which is the economic instrument of national power. This is where we name, shame, block their assets, which is quite important. And then the other thing that we love to do, having been formerly with the State Department, we like to cancel visas. Their family members who are studying, let's say, at Harvard or here at Georgetown. That seems to hurt them more. And I think you know that I spent a lot of time on the money piece.
Yes.
Super important. To me, the center of gravity of the Mexican cartels is the money. And unfortunately, that's where the politicians succumb to the money. It's really plato plomo. It really is that. And the more that we can go after the financiers, the better. I know we're looking at Sinaloa, but actually in the case of the Jalisco cartel, they were able to go after not just El Mencho, but his financier's name is El Tuli. And we're starting to do the financial forensics with the Mexicans to understand how they run the business. It's much harder to actually replace the accountant and the financier than the number 1, 2, 3 of how many chapitos are there, right, for Sinaloa?
Yeah, too many.
Not to mention their objective is to maximize profits. Everyone's in this business to make money.
So I don't want to make this into a Mexican civics panel, I want to be clear, but I do want to focus on one aspect of Mexican civic reform that plausibly plays into the Estado de Narco, and I want to get your opinions on it. Morena has been in control of Mexican government since just December 2018. Essentially, they've got supermajorities in the states and the legislature. They've controlled the presidency for 2 terms, which is a long time in Mexico. And so they have advanced this program, what they call the Cuatro Transformación, one element of which is essentially the elimination of independent civil society institutions. There's been a lot of cuts that have essentially eroded. I think the judicial reform is arguably the most consequential one, that have eroded independent centers of power throughout Mexico. How does that play into the phenomenon of the Estado de Narco?
Well, it looks like it's also part of a category that's a broader issue across Latin America and certain countries. It's democratic blacksiding, right? So the fact that you would not have the civic sector, if we think about any society, you have the public sector, the private sector, and the civic sector. And the civic sector is very important. And I would even put the journalists in the civic sector, right? And we've seen how they've been traumatized and attacked. And now, sadly, it is the most dangerous country to be in as a journalist. And it's disturbing. If you couple that with now less than an independent judiciary, I'll be diplomatic to say it, we would see in the past that officials would be elected and then corrupted, right? Now the fear that I have is, and it's not just in Mexico, but in other countries as well, that they're going to run their own candidates and finance their own candidates. So what you're going to see is it's going to bleed into the institutions where these people will be duly elected, right? They are going to run as candidates and then enter government, and then from inside corrupt. And this is where I fear that there are no longer independent watch groups in the civic sector that will raise issues and curb and make people accountable. And then if you have these people who are now elected, like basically they are the representatives of the narcos in whether it's municipal, state, or federal government. And this is what we're kind of seeing with Morena.
Very quickly, many years ago at the Wilson Center, we produced a book called Resilient Communities, where we looked at where communities had not, it wasn't that they were able to resist an onslaught by organized crime, but they were able to bounce back afterwards. And we found a very simple formula. It was where you actually had effective collaboration between 3 levels of government, federal, state, and local. It's where you had the cooperation of local journalists, civil society, and of the private sector, which meant that you only had a very small number of successful stories there, but it was worth drawing it out. Now when you sort of combine that with the story of today, where I would agree with you that over the past 8 years, we have seen sustained attacks on independent journalism, on civil society, and certainly we've seen quite open attacks during the AMLO administration against a lot of business leaders. It's not just under the Morena governments. This has happened before in Mexico as well. You know, the pre-government of Enrique Peña Nieto used the Pegasus spying software on civil society members as well. And lastly, on business. Business has been told very, very clearly, stop financing civil society organizations that are investigating corruption. And, you know, they know, the business leaders know that it's not in their interest to keep doing so. So that funding is drying up. And so it all begins to come together. Now, is the purpose to enhance the opportunities for organized crime? No. It's to protect the government from attacks and from criticism. But it has that perhaps unintended consequence as well.